this segment, we ask employers to explain these disheartening numbers. Only 19% of U.S. companies employ people with disabilities. Only 13.6% actively recruit people with disabilities. How do employers explain this? Perhaps the most frequent explanation we hear is that employers are concerned about the levels of social engineering that we try to achieve through the workplace. Employers, when you're right, you're right. In American business today, look at the enormous levels of contribution that you make. Certainly, we've asked more of American business than just make a better mousetrap. Give us a product that's affordable and safe, and allow yourselves a fair profit. But it really doesn't help us understand or explain these disability and employment statistics. In fact, it makes them more conspicuous. However, fortunately, from the sources that we showed you earlier, we have other really specific information about what you as employers think and feel on this subject. And what we hear from you quite often, most often is, McMahon, we'd like to have more people with disabilities in our workforce, but the nature of the work we have is not conducive to the employment of people with disabilities. Or, I'm just not sold. I'm not sold on the productivity, performance, or bottom line benefits of hiring Americans with disabilities. Employers, when you're right, you are right. Disability may indeed affect ability. After all, we have 14.5 million Americans receiving Social Security disability benefits today. The cost of those is $146 billion a year, plus another $100 billion a year for Medicare. Add to that 3 million veterans receiving $30 billion a year in indemnity payments, plus health care associated with their service-connected disability. That's a lot of money. These kinds of financial disincentives to work explain certain things. They explain the low labor market activity rate of 25% for Americans with disabilities, compared to 81% for non-disabled people. And they explain the fact that 40% of people with disabilities are living below the poverty threshold. Furthermore, if you were to go on Social Security disability income tomorrow, for example, probabilities that you would ever return to competitive employment are less than 1 in 200, less than 1/2 of 1%. So when you're talking about disability affects ability, you're right. But these people have already been bought out of the workforce, and they're not coming back. And they're not really the kinds of people with disabilities that we're talking about in this film. In this film, our concern is more with people with disabilities who do have residual assets and capabilities, despite the fact that they have a disability either pre-career or mid-career. Let me use myself for an example. Here I'll draw a circle. We'll call it McMahon. And in here, we'll put all of my knowledge, skills, and abilities that might be a benefit to you as an employer. We'll draw another circle, and we'll call this the world of work. And in the world of work, we have 19,000 distinct occupations in the United States. Now, as you can see, right in here is where I make my living, where my KSAs intersect with the requirements of those jobs. Now we're going to add to this the advent of a disability. And you can see that the disability has an impact. There's a large number of jobs now that cannot be done by a person with this disability. And over here, in terms of my KSAs, there are things that I can no longer do in the world of work. But if you look here, you'll see there's still a large number of occupations that my KSAs permit me to do. And I think we'd agree that that piece of the pie would expand and this piece of the pie would get smaller if we did things with me and for me, like reasonable accommodation, analyzing my transferable skills, or applying some good assistive technology. Before we leave this particular graphic, yes, we understand that this is an example where mid-career change on my part might be in order that's caused by a disability. But that may also have been caused by something like my aging. I get married, I get divorced, I have children, I have to care for my aging parents, I relocate, or I can't relocate to take advantage of an opportunity because I can't sell my house. And you're quite good at accommodating all those life circumstances. Why should it be any different for disability? What are some other facts of interest about this word qualified or this word productive? This time we're going to use a brief table where we're going to talk about the level of education of non-disabled Americans versus disabled Americans of working age. If we look at people with less than high school, the representation of non-disabled Americans in the workforce is only 7%. But for people with disabilities, it is 28%, 4 times as large. If we look at people with high school only or some college, we find that the numbers are roughly equivalent, 35 and 28, 28 and 31. But if we look at people who have a bachelor's degree or higher, we find that there's an enormous disparity. People without disabilities have a representation in the workforce of 30% of college degree people. People with disabilities, only 13%. So if by qualified, you mean level of formal education, you're definitely right. Disability does impact on ability, particularly in the completion of high school and four-year degree programs. But what about when the two groups are equally educated? Are there differences in their productivity and performance? If you adjust for education, the answer is no. By this I mean that employers like yourselves who hire workers with disabilities tell us 72% are average or above in terms of their performance evaluation. When we assess workers with disabilities directly, the number is even higher, of about 91%. But I know your interest is more in what are called the soft skills of human resources. There are literally hundreds of studies on these various dimensions, and I can tell you that when it comes to things like getting along with coworkers, the trainability of the worker, the task flexibility of the worker, the motivation of the worker, or the job satisfaction of the worker, there is no credible evidence that people with disabilities lag behind non-disabled people on these dimensions. Matter of fact, when it comes to a couple of other dimensions, like job tenure or attendance on the job, there's actually a small advantage to workers with disabilities. But the results of these studies at the same time trouble me, because there are some glaring characteristics about the studies themselves. Number one, almost all of the protestation and negative concerns about workers with disabilities come to us from those 81% of the employers who have little or no experience in the employment of people with disabilities. Conversely, we find that studies that show almost any advantage that exists to the worker with disability have been conducted by people who are disability advocates, or the studies themselves are very limited or weak in terms of the methodology. So what is the bottom line with respect to productivity? Small number of really great workers, smaller number of very weak workers, the vast majority of them just okay. That's what you can take away from all these studies of all these researchers, that in all these productivity indices, adjusted for education at least, people with disabilities compare quite favorably to people without disabilities. Now I understand also that pretty good in this economy may just not be good enough. Fortunately, the ADA protects you in that sense. And it says to all American businesses, where you set the bar in terms of a productivity standard for your workers is entirely your business. But wherever you set it must be evenly applied. There are other kind of secret things that employers will tell us in these environments of anonymity and trust. And one of these goes something like this. McMahon, we'd love to have more people with disabilities working here. However, we think it'd be upsetting to the other workers. But is there really any evidence of this? Your workers are all Americans. And with 1 in 6 Americans being disabled, isn't it true that they're likely to have a family member who also has a disability? And I believe, because remember we talked about distressed identification, that 50-cent psychological term that we now understand so well? I believe because of that each of your workers watches very, very carefully how you treat applicants with disabilities and other workers with disabilities, particularly if they're injured in the workplace, because they know full well that this could happen to them, just like that. Finally, some employers say, our coworkers appear to be pretty comfortable, but our concern in our particular industry, which is very special, is the reaction of customers. When you're right, but on this dimension, you could not be more wrong. Americans with disabilities, that's 54 million people. That's 1 out of every 6 Americans. 18% of our general population. That's 21 million families. That's a $1 trillion market segment. That's bigger than Gen X. That's bigger than teens. That's bigger than Gen Y. Second only to older Americans and baby boomers. And baby boomers is the fastest growing demographic of people with disabilities because, as we know, disability is associated with aging. Let's be really greedy for a moment. These people with disabilities, all these indemnity payments and poverty levels, do they have any cash? Yes, they do. 73% are heads of household, 58% own homes, 45% are the principal shoppers from their families. I know that you care a lot about what your customers think. But if you look at surveys done of the general people, you find some amazing statistics. 3/4 of Americans in general say, I see people with disabilities in the workplace every day. That's totally cool. 87% say they would prefer to use their purchasing power with a company that employed people with disabilities if they knew that that was happening. 65% say I'd even change brands to do so if the products were roughly equivalent in terms of quality or price. And 92% of American consumers say, I prefer to spend my money with companies that are socially responsible. Fear of coworker reaction, fear of public reaction. Haven't we been down this road before? Before World War II, this is how we felt about women in the workplace. And now women are 51% of our workforce and 60% of our college-age population. This is what we used to say about immigrants, about African Americans, about Hispanics, about gay people, even about veterans, at least from unpopular wars such as the Vietnam War. There is absolutely no research to support these fears about coworker reactions or public reactions. In fact, there's plenty of research and experience to the contrary, and at this time, in 2010, it's definitely time, long time, that we understand those notions are old hat and they should be put to rest.